It's the Eagle Community Television Forum with your host, Gary Shorman.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Shorman, and this is the Forum on Eagle Television. Our forum is brought to you by Hayes Med. Our guest today, you'll recognize him. He's our Senator, Senator Jerry Moran. And Senator, good to have you with us today.
Gary, great to be with you. Great to be back here at Eagle in Hayes, Kansas.
Well, you know what? One of the things that you have been now in Washington, D.C., I don't know how many years total. What's your total in Washington, D.C.?
A while. I hate to admit it, but it's a little about 20.
How have the last 12 months compared to the earlier times that you were there?
Well, Gary, first of all, I would say while I work in Washington, D.C., I don't live in Washington, D.C., and while you can say I've been there 20 years, I haven't been there. I've really been a Kansan, taking Kansas to Washington, D.C. instead of the reverse of taking Washington, D.C. back home here. But it is changing, and it's much more political, much more partisan. The big issues, we struggle to find common ground. It's true of our elected officials, it's true of members of Congress in Washington, D.C., but it's also true of constituents, of citizens. There is more division, I think, less willingness to cooperate and to find common ground, which takes some of the joy out of being a member of Congress. And more importantly, it makes it much more difficult to find solutions to problems that our country faces. So I can't say that there's a lot of things that I'm pleased with about the direction of politics and the public discourse occurring in our country right now. And regardless of one's point of view, I mean, I recognize that not everyone thinks like we do in Kansas, but every member of Congress ought to have the opportunity to represent their constituents. And there's going to be a lot of different backgrounds, different philosophies, different constituents, different ways of doing things, but we ought to find ways to work together. I would say that over a long period of time, people have been calling our office and they'd say, these would be Kansans calling in, giving me my instructions, and they'd talk to whoever answers the phone, and they would say, now you tell Jerry not to budge 1 inch on anything. And that's about half the people. And the other half call and say, why can't Jerry work with his colleagues and get something done? And the way I look at it is there are a few issues, a narrow set of issues in which there's not much room to budge, matters of integrity and promises, commitments that have been made, strongly held beliefs. But then the vast majority of things require us to work with people who might have a different perspective. And my job is to figure out which of those few things fit in that category that doesn't allow for much, if any, room to budge, and the vast majority of things which require that. And I would say that we're a minority. What I would say is that regardless of whether the Republicans are in the majority in the Senate or the Democrats are in the majority in the Senate, Jerry Moran represents a minority, and it's called Kansas, it's called rural America. And if we only insist on getting the things that we want, we don't have enough voices, enough votes to actually accomplish that. So we have no choice if we want to make things better where we come from, but to find people from other places, urban, suburban parts of the country, and work to accomplish their goals at the same time achieve ours.
You know, one of the things I notice in your schedule when you look at what you do spend, I'm not saying most of your time, but a considerable amount of your time back here in Kansas, whether it be weekends getting back here, traveling around the state. I just see you made, little towns, big towns, you travel the state and do a great job of doing that. What are people telling you? Because while people can make calls and you get the emails, when you're at those town hall meetings, whether it be Waukene, Kansas, or Clay Center, Kansas, what do they tell you there?
Well, this is the part of my job that I enjoy more. And actually, if you forced me to live in Washington, D.C., all the time, it's not a job I'd want. I like my life in Kansas, our life in Kansas, and I like the sense of community and belonging, and people seem more normal and common sense. So I like this. Washington, D.C. is a place in which, politics is 24/7, and while I like politics a lot less than I used to really enjoy politics, but it's never been anything that dominates my entire life. Politics is a means to accomplish good for Kansans and for the country, but it's not something that I think about day in and day out. And if you live in Washington, D.C., that's the topic of conversation.
You're in the fishbowl.
In every conversation. So we do. I mean, when I was a congressman representing the 1st District of Kansas, 63 counties here in our state, grew it to 69 over time. I had 69 town hall meetings every year. Now we work on 105 town hall meetings, giving people the chance to have a conversation, to tell me what's on their mind, to criticize and suggest, occasionally to encourage. And today's conversations, while it fluctuates with the topic of Washington, D.C., what the topic of the day is in Washington, and right now that's probably taxes, but people really haven't moved off of what was the main topic of conversation and debate in Washington, D.C. just a month ago, which is health care. And I would say that health care still dominates the conversation, and now, particularly since there's a provision that's been added in the Senate version of the tax bill dealing with health care, that's especially true. So taxes matter to people, but health care is much more personal. And both are very challenging to figure out what the right answers are, but I think healthcare is probably the most difficult issue and the one that comes up most often. Having said that, Kansans still focus on things that are related just to our state. And it's one of the things I've worked at maintaining, which is when I ask Kansans, when I ask our viewers to give me the chance to represent them in Washington, D.C., my request was based in part upon a desire to do what I could to make sure that rural America was alive and well, that we increase the chances that our kids stay in our hometowns or they come back to our hometowns. And so we have a very rural focus that deals with agriculture, farmers and ranchers, healthcare in a different perspective than what most of the talk in Washington, D.C. is today. How do we keep hospital doors open, physicians in our communities, pharmacy on Main Street? We begin to lose our communities if we lose access to health care. Technology, something that you are very familiar with and something that Eagle has been fully engaged in rural America. How do we make sure we're not left behind? And access to technology creates lots of opportunities in rural places that otherwise wouldn't exist, and a lot of policies made in Washington, D.C. So that plus small business, perspective of keeping the fixed cost of being in business down, means that businesses in rural communities where there's not a lot of increase in population have a better chance for survival. And education. Most education decisions, rightfully so, in my view, are made in Topeka and at home, but we have too much intrusion too often in Washington, D.C. that raise the cost of educating our kids, and there is no more important function of government, particularly at the state and local level, than education. So it's kind of the basics, and you asked me what people talk about. In recent days, it has been agriculture, trade, exports, farm commodity prices being as low as they are. The crunch, the squeeze on agriculture is for real. And I know a lot of our viewers aren't farmers, aren't ranchers, but there isn't a person that you and I will communicate with today that isn't affected by what happens in a farm economy. And a number of policies that are pending in Washington, D.C. has a huge consequence on whether or not agriculture is going to have some prosperity. So we never get away from the local kinds of things, which I appreciate.
One of the things, and you brought up several subjects, we could stay for an hour or two here and talk about some of these, but some of the key ones that we want to talk in is about the tax bill. That's still in flux. The House has passed theirs, Senate's working on getting theirs done. When you get questions on that, because it seems like it's such an immense bill, so many factors, it's really hard to get past, I'll say, the bullet points. Some of the big bullet points say, boy, we can't have that. How do you dig through that personally to say, okay, this is going to affect Kansans this way, this is going to affect rural this way, this is going to affect ag that way? How do you get through all the facts to get to how it's going to affect Kansas?
Gary, you're absolutely right. A change in the tax code, what benefits one person can be a detriment to another. And so it is hard to, we will not pass a tax code change, tax reform, tax cuts that don't have, with the same provision, somebody who's there to champion it and somebody who's there to say, this is terrible for me. And so those are difficult circumstances. I suppose every elected official prefers to do something that makes everyone happy. Changes in the tax code won't work. I would tell you that my goal, I am supportive of tax reform, tax changes. I'd love to see a simpler tax code. I would hope that nearly every American could file a tax return without needing professional help. I don't think we'll get there. I would assure our accountants and CPAs and lawyers that there will still be plenty of work to be done regardless of how this debate ends up and what actually becomes law. But I think the goal for me is to do this in a way that doesn't increase the national debt and at the same time increases jobs. Too many times we talk about economic growth or economic development. What that really means to me is more jobs, better jobs, higher paying jobs, more secure jobs. We have a tax code that in too many instances discourages business from being in the United States and growing in the United States. And I know over the years the number of people who've called me to say, let's punish those companies who've taken their jobs outside our borders. I understand that sentiment, but probably what we ought to be doing is getting rid of the reasons that it's better to be outside the United States than to be in the United States for job creation. So it is the large talking points. The Senate, I think, has a better product at the moment than the House. If we pass something, I mean, I wish we were doing this in a different way. It may turn out that this is going to be a Republican-only supported bill, although the theory by the political pundits, the analysts who write stories in Washington, D.C., is that the Democrats will not provide a single vote for tax reform until Republicans pass it, and then there'll be a dozen of them who vote for it, under the theory that they prefer to see Republicans fail again. And this goes back to the conversation that started our program, which is what's different today. And so politics has become a game. Who wins and who loses? And if Democrats can keep tax reform from passing, then it'd be, in a sense, a black eye. Republicans can't get their agenda done. We elected these people and they still haven't accomplished anything. But on the other hand, if it looks like it's going to pass, then the provisions may be popular enough that they join us.
One of the things you and I talked about a week ago about employee ownerships, employee-owned companies, and Eagle, of course, is 300 employee owners out here doing our job, but that's a small company in the whole sense of things. There's a lot of small businesses in Kansas, and it would look to me like if we can keep the tax code so it's easy enough for small business to be successful, like employee-owned companies or other small companies to do that, it really helps Kansas because you don't see the Amazons, you don't see the Apples, you don't see these giant corporations sitting around in Kansas. You see more companies like Eagle.
Well, when you change the corporate tax rates, you're going to be, I assume, accused of taking care of wealthy people. I have little interest in taking care of wealthy people. I do want, as I said, more jobs, better jobs, higher paying jobs. In Kansas, that's mostly going to mean that small business has a better chance of prospering and remaining in our state, remaining viable. And we face lots of challenges in that regard. But employee ownership is one of the ways that, as Eagle is owned by its employees, it's a role model, it's an example of how a couple of things. One, in my view, it creates an incentive for employees who now have a stake in the company to perform at their utmost to see that the company is successful. It's more likely that means that company is going to be in Kansas, in a smaller town. Too often what we see in our state is that when an owner of a business retires or dies, the only market they can see for their company is to sell it to some bigger company, and then more likely than not, that bigger company moves the business and the job someplace else to a bigger city or where they're located. And we've seen instances, and Eagle is one of them, in which the opportunity for a business to remain local and to employ Kansans and to be a part of a community occurs because of employee ownerships, ESOPs. And the tax bill that we're debating will keep, at least in the Senate, will keep ESOPs alive and well, and I think that's a desired outcome, not only for the employees and the current ESOPs, but for more opportunities for Kansas businesses to remain in Kansas.
And that's a great point, because if they stay here, they stay in the communities that they serve, and that's a part of it. You grew up in a small town right north of Hays, Plainville, Kansas. You ended up in Hays for a while. You talked about Washington being so much different. Long term, we want to keep what's in Kansas, keep it good. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back and talk about how we do that, how you do that when you get to Washington, D.C. Our guest, Senator Jerry Moran. Back with more after this.
Hays Med is your first and best choice for healthcare. They're the only facility providing tertiary level services in this region. With more than 70 physicians and 26 specialties ranging from heart, orthopedic, spine care, cancer, obstetrics and gynecology, wound care, rehabilitation and surgery, including the Da Vinci robotic surgery, HaysMed is your comprehensive health provider for people throughout Western Kansas. HaysMed, helping people be healthy.
Are you frustrated with Wi-Fi dead zones in your home? It happens when you don't have Boost, the cutting-edge Wi-Fi solution from Eagle Communications. A Boost-certified Eagle technician maps your home, then installs a dual-band modem and router, plus discrete access points to deliver wall-to-wall Wi-Fi with no dead zones. Boost powers all your family's devices in all the places you love to live. Get Boost. Wi-Fi made simple. Only from Eagle Communications. Call today.
Welcome back to the second half of our forum. Our special guest here today is Senator Jerry Moran. You get a chance, and this program will be running between the holidays. And so you get a chance to see families, local communities, you get a chance to visit with families. When you go back, what do you tell people when, they come from Washington, D.C., New York, Philadelphia, and you go, here I am from Kansas. How do you explain our world here?
I explain our world regularly because I think there is a misconception. I mentioned earlier, for example, that we focus on small business. We talked about the tax code and what it means to small business, what it means to a community to have small businesses. I've said over the years that where I come from, economic development can be whether or not there's a grocery store in town. And almost no one in the nation's capital would understand why that would be an issue. And I don't mean that Congress needs to pass a law requiring a grocery store, but you take into account the things that drive up the cost of being in business. So the chance of a grocery store or a hardware store or a newspaper or a cable television company has a greater chance of success often when those businesses are located in communities with not a growing population. It's one of the things, I think about communities that I've represented now a long time, and I would say it this way. When I was a congressman and representing the 1st District of Kansas, I'm not sure that I represented a single community that had a growing population. And that reminds me about the importance of keeping the cost. You don't have more customers to sell more things to, so the fixed cost of being in business matters for the outcome. And there's lots of small rural issues. In my view, our community banks are suffering, and as a result, less likely to make loans at a time when we desperately need capital as a result of the passage of legislation years ago called Dodd-Frank, response to the 2008 mortgage crisis, the demise of the financial institutions on Wall Street. Mistakenly, small community banks got wrapped up in this, and their ability to lend money is so important. And I look at this today in agriculture. I would bring home for Kansans the fires, for example, that occurred in a number of counties in Kansas. Perhaps Clark, Ashland as the county seat is the most well-known, Barber County the year before. So you have a fire that destroys all your cattle, you have no collateral left, and you can't borrow money unless you got a community bank that's willing to step in and make a difference. And we need to make sure the regulations, and again, people don't think about that, but that's a rural kind of thing that my colleagues in Washington, D.C. would not be aware of. And what I tell really, in a broader sense, the Thanksgiving and the holiday season to Christmas gives me the opportunity to tell people about the quality of people. What we're really trying to keep going is a way of life that allows for parents to be good parents, schools to be a place of high quality education, a community that loves their neighbors and wraps themselves around them in times of joy and problems and disaster. And we see it in Kansas all the time. And so while you can talk about agriculture and you can talk about small business and the things that make up rural Kansas, it really is the people, the way we were raised, the way the community's developed, in which we have an appreciation for each other. And again, back to our opening conversation, if in the town where people are seeing this program, we kind of know where people go to church. We know what their politics are, whether they're a Republican or a Democrat, a liberal or a conservative. But we don't end up in having a fist fight. We don't end up having even a verbal challenge. We respect people for who they are and know where they come from, and that's missing in Washington, D.C. In communities across Kansas, we don't divide up into a Republican team and a Democrat team in the community. We work together to make whatever your position or particular view is, you work together to make good things happen in the community. And that's too often what's missing in Washington.
Well, sometimes the one shoe fits all sizes kind of thing doesn't work when you're talking about rural versus great big business. And you work hard, I know, to fight for that, to make sure we're represented well. Several things on the agenda. I know we're going to run out of time here at some point. We could talk for hours. Let's talk about agriculture. What do you do? What's happening in the world of agriculture? Is the tax bill, is there an effect on that, or what happens there?
Here's my most important point for agriculture in the minutes that we have remaining. I am very worried that the administration is going to withdraw from NAFTA. And while NAFTA has challenges, it matters greatly to agriculture all the time, but particularly with commodity prices as low as they are. And so NAFTA is a trade agreement developed a long time ago, before I was ever in Congress. And it's an agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And here's a fact. Mexico is the largest purchaser of agricultural commodities from Kansas. We have, I suppose, 98, 99% of the mouths to feed are outside the world. Sometimes even a Kansan will say, well, let's just take care of ourselves, let's just feed ourselves and forget everybody else. The question you could ask, what nearly 50% of acres do you no longer want to farm in Kansas? Because if we aren't selling it outside the U.S., there's no need to grow it in the quantities that we do. And I'm worried the administration, I'm pretty certain that their plan is to withdraw from NAFTA, claim they got 6 months to renegotiate a new agreement. And I think they have the belief that agriculture is so important in feeding the rest of the world that Mexico and Canada will cave. It doesn't take into account Argentina and Brazil and other places who will fill in that gap if we're not in the export market. So you mentioned the tax code. There's a few things that affect agriculture, although to me not terribly significant. But the point I would make, particularly with the tax code being debated, is if we don't have income, farmers' tax rates are irrelevant. If we don't have income in a community, people aren't earning a living, then it doesn't really matter what the tax code is. And so we need to be a state that continues to export around the globe. And particularly this agreement, we need to negotiate and make sure that everybody gets a better deal, but it doesn't mean withdrawing in hopes that we can negotiate it from scratch.
Let's talk just quickly about Obamacare. It's been added by the Senate into the tax bill. How does that does it muddy the waters, or does it clear it up?
It does, and while I'm not a supporter of the Affordable Care Act of Obamacare, what we do to replace it or to fix it needs to have substance to it. We need to know what we're doing, and we need to give people a chance. I mean, the way I look at my job is trying to thread a needle in which we take care of people who they or their families have a pre-existing condition, but there's also this overriding issue that the premiums are still unaffordable. People can't afford their insurance, and so can we do things that reduce the cost of insurance at the same time as in threading that needle to take care of people who have a pre-existing condition? And I would argue that Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, and what the Republican plan was a few months ago, we're headed in we're at the wrong point. We ought to be talking about let's drive out the unnecessary cost of health care. Otherwise, all we're doing is passing unaffordable health care from one payer to a next, none of which is affordable. So look at the things that drive up unnecessarily the cost of health care and focus on them. One of the issues when we talk about health care that I don't want to miss the opportunity to mention is our veterans. Access to the VA.
You've been a real supporter of the VA and what goes on with our veterans.
Well, I would change your words just a bit, Gary, because I guess I'm a supporter of the VA, but I'm a supporter of the veterans. And I actually kind of have a mixed relationship with the VA. Sometimes I'm cheering them on, and sometimes I'm disappointed.
You're trying to improve them.
I am trying to improve them so that no one falls through the cracks. And I certainly can. I have lots of conversations in which veterans tell me how well the VA has cared for them. On the other hand, I have lots of conversations in which people say we can't get the VA to respond, we're caught in a bureaucracy, they don't return our phone calls, too many people slipping through the cracks. And one of the things for most of the communities that will see this program is the choice program is in place, it's the law. And what it says is that if you're a veteran that lives 40 miles or more from a VA facility, or if it takes the VA more than 30 days to provide the healthcare services you need, then you can have those services performed at home, hometown hospital, hometown doctor. And for us in our part of Kansas, across our state, in the distances we have, that's a great benefit. Unfortunately, the VA didn't like this law, in my view. They implemented it in a way that made it very difficult. And I just would tell veterans or people who know veterans who are watching our program, if you've tried it and it didn't work, or if you know somebody who might try it, it might be beneficial to them, let us know so we can go to bat. I want this program to work. We'll go to bat for every veteran we can to see that they get the care that they need. And if they want to have it done in the community, I would tell them they have to get the VA's permission in advance. You just can't show up at your local doctor's office. But if you're having trouble with that program, call me, let me know, and we'll see if we can't get this to work. My example, hometown example of Plainville, a veteran calls me to say, Jerry, I called the VA in Wichita and I told him I actually thought he said he wanted a colonoscopy. People tell me no one says that. So he must have said he needed a colonoscopy. And he said, you know, I called the VA in Wichita and I said, I'd like to have that done here at home. And the response was, oh, I'm sorry, sir, you can't do that. You live within 40 miles of Hayes, where there's an outpatient clinic. And the veteran says, no, I've already called them. They don't do colonoscopies. And the VA's response is, that doesn't matter. There's still a facility within 40 miles. And that's the kind of junk, the kind of circumstance we want to get rid of. It will also help our community healthcare delivery system. Just like our schools need every student, our hospitals need every patient. And so as we keep veterans in our community, it will strengthen the healthcare delivery system for everyone.
Couple things to go through. Regulation in general. The last administration, there were 8 years, it seemed like multiplying, increasing regulatory issues where you had to have more people on staff to cover some of these things. A couple of those have sort of changed recently. One of those is net neutrality, kind of a weird word. It's a wonky kind of thing. What's net neutrality? But it did bring layers of regulation on top of whether it be wireless providers like ourselves. Banking, there's another thing in banking where all of a sudden some of the regulations, you mentioned that earlier, are being taken away. I see that happening over the last 6 months, 8 months. Some of that regulation is changing, and that's for the good.
If there is, if you want to highlight some of the successes, we have the ability to rein in the regulatory world that particularly occurred during the Obama administration. But I would say, to make clear this isn't just a partisan statement, we've had increasing regulations over a long period of time. Just didn't happen within the last 8 years. It's happened over the last 50 years. Government in Washington, D.C. continues to grow. And you said this earlier, and it's so true, and it's about us in rural. One size solution does not fit all problems. And so they don't understand how burdensome a regulation can be. And I think, you know, what we're after is some common sense and, you know, sound science on the environmental regulatory side. But we also need to recognize that the best way to increase the number of jobs and therefore improve the chances that Americans, Kansans, have the opportunity to live the American dream is to allow free markets to work, to reduce the regulation to the extent that we can. It doesn't mean that there isn't going to be or shouldn't be regulations, but we need the common sense and just the minimal amount that makes sure that you know, people and businesses behave with the greatest amount of freedom to pursue the American dream. It's one of the issues in which this comes up is entrepreneurship, innovation, startup companies. More cost of starting a business means fewer businesses are going to start. We need more businesses, not less.
And you can't have people taking care of regulation instead of taking care of customers. And that makes a big difference. If you can build, and if you have that entrepreneur that has to spend more time in the office trying to figure out how to do paperwork for payroll and everything else, they're not going to be building a customer.
Healthcare is the example. When I say we ought to find ways to get rid of the underlying cost of healthcare, why it costs so much money, the bureaucracy, the rules, the regulations is clearly one of those areas. When you go to your doctor's office, look how many people sit behind the counter to take the bill, to get the bill paid, to tell you how much you owe them, as compared to actually delivering healthcare. Those regulations, and in many instances, are a significant part of why, if we lose more hospitals in rural communities, it will be because the regulatory burden keeps increasing and they have to hire more people, not to care for you as a patient, but to meet the government mandates.
One of the things in your position as a senator, you get to represent us as Kansans in interesting places. You spent a little bit of time in Afghanistan. How does that compare to Western Kansas?
It's much bleaker and more barren, and certainly more dangerous. I would pay tribute to the men and women that I visited with when I was in Afghanistan. I was there in September and was in Bagram, which is a major military installation, and Kabul, where the center of the Afghan government, but also on the Pakistan border in an outpost, in a training camp where Americans are training, American soldiers, NATO soldiers actually, are training Afghans to battle for us. I'm not a believer that we are the policemen of the world, but I do know, and so I wouldn't be likely to put troops in harm's way where we're just trying to stabilize somebody else's government or create a different government around the world. But I do know where we stand with terrorism, and we are at risk. It's real, and there are groups around the globe, but particularly in the Middle East, who are interested in killing Americans, ending our way of life, damaging our relationships with our allies, and we have a responsibility. 23 of those groups are headquartered in Afghanistan, and in this case where we are fighting terrorism that's attacking us, that's after Americans and our way of life, our servicemen and women have a serious challenge, but in my view, a noble cause. And the good news from my perspective, among other things, is that, for example, when I was at the hospital at Bagram, most of the patients that are admitted, overwhelmingly, the patients who are admitted for care and treatment at that hospital are Afghanis, not NATO or American troops. That tells me that the battle is being conducted on the front lines by the people who are most affected.
You do a great job of representing Kansas. You're back here all the time. You're doing that. We get to vote on somebody to represent us as a whole in our state, and you carry the flag for Kansas very well, so appreciate all you do.
Gary, great to be with you.
Great
Appreciate
to be
it.
with you too, and happy holidays to you and your family. I know it's when you travel, you know, you get a chance to be away from family, but Robba does a great job. Your two daughters do a great job of representing you as well, and the family.
Well, we appreciate the opportunity Kansans have given us, and you asked me how long I'd served there. It's lasted longer than I expected, or at least originally wanted. And we're anxious to live a normal life and be part of a community again, and those days will come in the future.
Well, I enjoy having you here because when you showed up this morning, it's nice to have a senator, but it's also nice to have a friend stop by and say hi. Our guest today, Senator Jerry Moran, representing the state of Kansas in Washington, D.C., and traveling around the state right now, talking to you. You get a chance, you see that he's in your town, stop by, talk to him about what's important to you. Senator, happy holidays. Thanks for watching The Forum here on Eagle Television. It's brought to you by Hayes Med and by Eagle Communications, our community connected.
It's a beautiful day in our super high-speed internet great customer service neighborhood. Like you, this is where we live. In fact, our company is employee-owned, so it's our goal to improve the quality of life for everyone in our community by delivering faster, more reliable internet, clearer, more feature-laden phone service, quality TV channels, all with the level of customer service you'd expect from people who are your neighbors. Eagle Communications, our community connected.